Here we go into History of the Israel and the Jews, Part 2. And I felt it was appropriate to actually pick up the second part, which covers mostly the modern history of the land of Israel and the Jewish people. So what we find is that as we're looking through our history, we come up with what it became known as the Palestinian Partition Plan proposed by the United Nations in 1947. It was proposed by UN Resolution 181, which was the partition plan for Palestine. What you've got to remember is that Jordan was already established as a country. So it was not about actually doing anything with Jordan at all. Jordan already existed. It was about what happened to the Palestine as far as this setting up a homeland for the Arabs, or more importantly, for the Jewish people. And the UN partition plan, you will see on that map on the left-hand side, gave a significant amount of the land to an Arab state, and what is left was given to the Jewish state. As you can see, a significant amount of the 23% that they were originally proposing was actually given to the Arab state. Jerusalem, however, was going to remain as part of the UN admin, just because nobody could really decide who should have responsibility for it. So what we find here is that this was accepted by the Jewish Agency, which had been set up by this time to basically run whatever country was going to be established, but it was rejected by the Arab nations. However, in 1948, we find that we get to the end of the British Mandate on the 14th of May. The State of Israel was declared on the 14th of May. An interim government was set up, and almost immediately Israel was invaded by 5 Arab states to actually try and get rid of the land. And the war went on for the rest of that year. Various skirmishes. It wasn't a full-scale war, but it was pretty intense. And the IDF did amazingly well. There were some real miracles that occurred as far as the IDF were concerned. And in 1949, an armistice agreement was made with Egypt, Syria, Jordan and Lebanon. Jerusalem was divided under Israeli and Jordanian rule. And Israel was admitted to the United Nations on the 4th of March. And we see in this plan here, and see this map, you can see the agreed armistice lines. You can see that Israel had made considerable gains as far as land was concerned. Egypt had occupied Gaza and was left under their control. Jordan had invaded and became, the land that they had invaded became called the West Bank. I always love the fact that the Jordan is the only river to have one bank. We only ever hear about the West Bank. We never hear about what's going on the East Bank of the river. And those were the agreed armistice lines. If you actually look at this particular map here, and there's a lot more detail on this, you will see that there are quite a few areas of no man's land all the way along the southern border. There's a little area particularly in the middle, just to the west of Jerusalem. You can see that Transjordan has now formally got what they've referred to as the West Bank. And the northern border had a particularly wide no man's land, which was to remain for quite a long period of time. So let's have a look at these borders in a little bit more detail. This is the northern border with Lebanon. You will notice that actually there are a couple of demilitarized zones. Now the area in the south around Tel Qasir, which was actually supposedly a demilitarized zone, eventually Syria moved in on it, and was very importantly that the IDF pushed them back from that, because that southern end of the Sea of Galilee contained sluice gates that actually controlled the water that was going to flow down the Jordan Valley, which was used by both Israel and Jordan for irrigation. And obviously whoever holds control over water actually holds a huge amount of power. And I think water is going to become a huge issue as we actually move on in history from these days. If we look at the southern borders, okay, you can see that there we have the Gaza Strip, which was, if you like, in control by Egypt. Right the way up, there was going to be an area at the top that was transferred to Israel. Basically, it was a rather jagged border across a bit of desert, so they just decided to draw a line across the sand. I don't know whether anybody's ever tried to draw a line across sand in the sandpit, but in the end, it actually became a wall because that was the only way to actually mark that particular border. If you actually look now at the border across the southern territories, across between Transjordan, there was all sorts of areas moved around, bits and pieces, as part of that armistice arrangement. But if we move on, history-wise, we find that we get to 1956, and in 1956, the Egyptians decided that they were going to take control of the Suez Canal, and also going to take control of any shipping in the Gulf of Suez, and also particularly in the Gulf of Araba, which of course limited Israel to actually where they could bring ships in, and of course the top end, the top end of the Red Sea was quite important for them. So therefore, Israel occupied, during the Suez Crisis War, occupied all of that territory known as Sinai. It was very important for them, and that was one of the things that happened there. Eventually, the IDF pulled back, and the Sinai Peninsula was actually given back to Egypt. In 1964, we find that there was a formation of something called the Palestine Liberation Organization. Now, what is important for us is this piece of text here is actually taken from the covenant set up by the PLO. I don't know whether anybody's ever actually read the PLO covenant. I can assure you I have. And I have just extracted these two bits from what you might call the preamble at the sort of beginning of their covenant. There are loads and loads of articles all the way through. But I think if we just read the top two here, you will actually just get a feel for what it is that the PLO stand for and their whole attitude. It says, "We, the Palestinian Arab people, who face the forces of evil, injustice, and aggression against whom the forces of international Zionism and its colonialism conspire and work to displace it," that is the Arab people, "and dispossess it from its homeland, to realise its freedom and dignity, and who has determined to amass its forces and mobilise its efforts and capabilities in order to continue its struggle and to move forward on the path of holy war until complete and final victory has been obtained. We, the Palestinian Arab people," let's just move my picture out of the way, "depending upon our right of self-defence and complete restoration of our homeland to completely rid the world of Zionism and its people." So the PLO covenant very clearly says that their primary aims are to completely rid the world of Zionism and its peoples. And I think that's very important that we actually understand that is the background to the PLO. So what we find is that actually over in 1967, we find the 1967 Six-Day War, which lasted 6 days, and Israel was again attacked on numerous sides, and as a result of that, the end of the 6 days, Israel was again in occupation of the Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Now, the Golan Heights, of course, is very significant as far as Israel is concerned, because it's a very high place, and anybody who owns the high places will actually realise that they actually control the whole area. Also worth noting at that point that Jerusalem was reunited. There was no longer an East Jerusalem and a West Jerusalem, but the whole of Jerusalem was united under Jewish control. Jumping on, we find that in 1973 there was a Yom Kippur War. Israel, by the way, had pulled back from the Sinai Peninsula. However, in 1973, in the Yom Kippur War, Israel moved back into Sinai again to defend basically its southern border against Egypt and against Lebanon. Syria and Jordan had joined in together to fight, but actually in reality there were massive land gains by Israel, and in reality Israel ended up with 4 times the amount of land that it started the conflict with. Of course, they didn't start the conflict, but actually that was important. And then we jump on and we find that in 1982 we have a peace treaty is agreed. It took months, years to actually pull this all together. And in 1982 there was finally a peace treaty was pulled together. And actually you find that the land occupied by Israel contained Gaza, what we'll call it the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, that were then agreed as belonging to Israel. And it looked like there was going to be peace. However, it lasted 24 hours when Israel started to be attacked by missiles and various other things, particularly from the north in Lebanon. In order for us to understand a little bit more of what's going on, I don't know any of you have actually read the Hamas Covenant. Okay, Hamas was formed in 1988, and I thought I would just read to you its opening aims and then 1 or 2 of the articles. It's worth downloading it. You can easily just type Hamas Covenant into Google and there you will find it's the top article. There is a version in Arabic and there's a version in English, and this is taken from the English version. The English version says the following. It says, Israel and the Jews will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it has obliterated others before it. So therefore, right at the very beginning, we have this, that the aim is basically to destroy Israel and the Jews. So let's have a look at Article 6. Article 6, can I just say that a lot of these articles are talking about how elections may or may not be conducted, who will run various aspects of the country. But here we find in Article 6, it says the Islamic resistance movement is a distinguished Palestinian movement whose allegiance is to Allah and the way of life is Islam. It strives to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine, for under the wing of Islam, followers of all religions can coexist in security and safety where their lives, possessions and rights are concerned. In the absence of Islam, strife will be rife, oppression spreads, and evil prevails, and schisms and wars will break out. Basically, they are saying there that unless Islam is in charge of all the nations and people are subject to Islam, then there will be these things. Article 7 says the Islamic resistance movement is one of the links in the chain of the struggle against the Zionist invaders. The day of judgment will not come until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, "O Muslims, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." Article 13, and this is very important when people actually say, we need to have a peace treaty. We need to agree something. Let's see what this actually says. Article 13 says initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals and international conferences are a waste of time and vain endeavours. Here we go. So they are not going to engage in any peace talks. Article 15. The day that the enemies usurp part of Muslim land, jihad becomes the individual duty of every Muslim. In the face of Jews' usurpation of Palestine, it is compulsory that the banner of jihad be raised. It's basically saying that every Muslim across the world, it is their compulsion to be part of this removal of the Jews from Palestine. Article 32. World Zionism, together with the imperialistic powers, try through a studied plan and intelligent strategy to remove one Arab state after another from the circle of struggle against Zionism in order to have it finally face the Palestinian people only. Egypt was, to a greater extent, removed from the circle of the struggle through the treacherous Camp David agreement. They are trying to draw other Arab countries into similar agreements and to bring them outside the circle of the struggle. The Zionist plan is limitless. After Palestine, the Zionists aspire to liberate from the Nile to the Euphrates. When they have digested the region they overtook, they will aspire to further expansion and so on. Their plan is embodied in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. By the way, I can't find that article. I've searched for it. I cannot find. So if somebody can find it and send it to me, I'll be interested to read it and find out what that actually says. It says the Islamic resistance movement considers itself to be the spearhead of the circle of struggle with world Zionism and a step along the road. Islamic groupings all over the Arab world should also do the same, since these are the best equipped for the future role of the fight with warmongering Jews. So there we have it. That's what the Hamas covenant says. So let's just sort of continue to work our way through. So we move on to 1993. We have the Oslo Accords, where both sides, in other words Jews and Arabs, agreed that a Palestinian Authority could be established. This was, if you like, the political wing of the PLO, and they would be established and assume governing responsibilities in the West Bank and Gaza Strip over a 5-year period. And it said an Area A extending via B to C. Couldn't find that on the map. It says then permanent status talks on the issue of borders, refugees and Jerusalem would be held. So in 1993 it was agreed that the Palestinian Authority would start governing responsibilities in Gaza and in the West Bank, as long as they actually kept things under control. And we find that actually, if we sort of move on, we have the Camp David Accords, which was a proposal in the year 2000, where the state of Palestine is the area in pale yellow. So we've got Palestine, where the Philistines lived in all those years back. The yellow is to be Palestine in the West Bank area. There was an area in blue which was going to be annexed to Israel, particularly on the river, and there were going to be some long-term lease areas here. But the agreement was that any Arabs who were living in that area that they call Palestine at that point in time would probably eventually be transitioned across to a Jewish control. But you already had large numbers of Jewish settlements in that particular area. One of the things that happened almost immediately after that was the Second Intifada started, where there were attacks on Israel, on Jewish settlements, on Jewish towns. Rockets were fired from Palestine into the land of southern of Israel, and Hezbollah in the north actually started firing rockets into northern Israel. So what we actually find is that in 2005, quite a significant thing happened, was that there was what called the disengagement plan. Everyone who was Jewish was moved out of the Gaza Strip. Lock, stock and barrel. Homes were left, they were given a date, and anybody who refused was literally picked up by the IDF and carried out of Gaza. So you can see those blue dots, which were Jewish built-up areas, they were abandoned. The Jewish people were moved out of Gaza and were actually given properties and areas in what we refer to as the West Bank. They were given opportunities to live in what were the Jewish built-up areas in return for actually the Palestinians being given full control over the Gaza Strip. Can I just say that Almost immediately, rockets were fired out of the Gaza Strip into Israel. But as part of the agreement, Israel were to supply Gaza with water, gas and electricity for no charge whatsoever. And Israel has continued to do that almost until today, until the attacks of the 7th of October, even though they did continue with their major water pipeline into Gaza. But it's interesting that the people who were in control of Gaza at that particular point in time turned the taps off on their side of the border, so it is reported. Can I also say that prior to the events in October, there were in excess of 17,000 people a day came out of Gaza to work in Israel. And those who worked in the land of Israel, they were given full rights for access to medicine and that sort of thing for themselves and their families. All medical care was taken care of. As you're probably aware, that in 2007, Hamas took control of all power in Gaza. Okay, and one of the things that's important to realise is that billions of euros every year have been given to the Hamas in Gaza for building infrastructure and for maintaining the country. I was interested to note that I happened to know of somebody who had some photos that they were trying to access, having trouble reading them off the SIM card. I managed to get them off the SIM card. And actually, when we looked at them, I said, "Where have you been on holiday?" And they said, "Oh, we've been to Gaza. We've been staying on the Gaza Strip, on the coast." And I must admit, a lot of the hotels and all the bits and pieces was a bit like the Monte Carlo of the Mediterranean, of the other end of the Mediterranean. The other thing that's quite interesting is that on the day that Hamas attacked into Israel, I immediately went and had a quick look at the map, and Google Street View was actually working on that day. But the next day, when I decided I'd come and try and grab some photos of the seafront in Gaza, Google Street View had been taken offline. So it brings us more or less up to today, and here we have the picture of, I found this particular picture, it was on the news, and we find that today we have 22 Arab states and we have one Jewish state. We have a total population of Arabs of 440 million, and there's 7.5 million Jewish people living in the land of Israel. There are about 5 million square miles of land which are available for Arabs to live in. And as you can see, there is the 0.009 million square miles of land for Jewish people to live in. Can I say there are approximately 15.3 million Jews who live worldwide and who declare themselves as being active Jews. But those eligible for returning to the land, it's about 25 million Jews are eligible to return to the land of Israel today. So let's just have a look as we wrap up now. Let's have a look at one or two questions. Can I just ask, if you ever engaged in a conversation with somebody, a couple of questions here. Do Jews have a right to self-determination as a state? Don't get drawn out as where. But if somebody says, yes, Jewish people do have a right to have a nation. And then you ask, does Israel itself have a right to exist? And if they say yes to that question, well, then congratulate them on being a Zionist. Another question to ask is, how will a two-state solution work, given that one of the parties is covenanted to destroy the other? And a couple of other questions you might be interested to ask. So why not give Alaska back to the Russians? America bought Alaska off the Russians, or even go further back and give it to the American Indians. After all, there's oil in Alaska. How about giving California back to the Spanish? After all, they were the group who were there living before the Americans came. So, the Americans came across and drove the Spanish out. Or how about giving Transjordan back to the Bedouins, who were actually displaced in 1922 to live in the area of Saudi Arabia? Interesting thoughts, something to think about. So how can we help today? A couple of last little bits and pieces. One of the things I would say is support Israel by what we say. As Christians, the Bible says we should be supporting Israel. Buy Israeli products where we can. I'm sitting here in my house recording this, and as I look around at the various bits of kit that I've got on this table, I can see that the majority of these bits of kit are actually built with electronics that were either manufactured in Israel or were actually designed and manufactured under license of Israeli products. What I would say to you is know your Nobel Peace Prize winners. If you look at that, all of those, what do we come up with? However many it is, about 100 and nearly 200 Nobel Peace Prize winners were Jewish. Ask somebody, are they diabetic? If they are, insulin that we're currently manufactured worldwide was actually developed in Israel. Those of you who've had a general anaesthetic, as you know full well, there's two parts of the anaesthetic. There's a little white bit that goes in, which is actually something that makes it comfortable. For the profanol, that white milky substance that they put in, the one that when they squeeze that tube in, they ask you to count upwards or backwards from 10 or backwards from 100, and normally most people don't get past 96. That is actually developed and manufactured in Israel, and you imagine what if we couldn't have profanol as an anaesthetic drug, the effect that that would have. Look at those of you who have an Android phone. The chip that you have in your phone was designed and developed in Israel. And it's interesting that the chip that is actually used in most of the iPhones, but not the newer ones, was also developed in Israel as a result of some of the conflicts and them needing some really, really good communications. So know some information and have it to hand. So finally, the final challenge I want to leave with you as part of this talk this evening is number one is, do you know the God of Israel who sent his son, that is Jesus, to die? Because of course Jesus was a Jew. He lived in Israel. Sent it God who sent his son to die that we might have everlasting life. Jesus died. He was born in Israel. He died in Israel. He rose again in Israel. The first church was established in Israel. So therefore we do owe a debt to the Jewish people. Are you full of the Holy Spirit and praying as directed by God? Can I say to you, if ever you can't sleep, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, if nothing else. Because that's what we are commanded to do. In Psalm 122 verse 6 says the following: pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. If nothing else, it says you will prosper if you pray for the peace of Jerusalem. In Malachi 3, verse 6, it says, for I am the Lord, I do not change. Therefore you are not consumed, O sons of Jacob. Interestingly, therefore, God never rejects the Jewish people. The Bible says, I do not change. His covenant does not change. God made a covenant with the Jewish people. Okay, so that covenant has been superseded when it comes to us as Christians. But God still has a covenant with his Jewish people. And it says in Genesis 12, we go back to the passage we started with, where it says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. So I would leave you with that challenge. I hope you have found that useful and informative. And hopefully you will be able to be one who receives the blessings from God as you bless his people, the Jews.